Good evening to the over 600 of you on tonight's webinar. I'm Sherry Dikowski, Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Ventura County. And along with my co-host, Cindy Silverman, Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Santa Barbara, we welcome everyone to the 2020 Goldberg-Tobin debate, Left versus Right, the battle for the soul of American Jewry. The federations, synagogues, and JCCs across the country that are on the screen represent a consortium created to bring you the best available programs possible during this unique time of virtual life. Each professional in your respective communities is struggling to keep Jewish life alive and vibrant. It is not possible without your help. If you are able, please be generous with your support for their mission so that when we emerge from out of this dark tunnel, we emerge together. There's a story I would like to share with you. During World War I, German soldiers found themselves in trenches facing fellow Jews from numerous opposing countries. Covered in mud in the darkness of night, many would whisper across the trenches to each other in Yiddish, "Are you a Jew?" If the answer was yes, "I am a Jew," then each would do everything in their power not to fire upon each other. Above country, nationalism, or patriotism, there are the ties that bind us together above all, the Jewish people. Am Yisrael Chai. In whispers, they found each other. Imagine what we could do. In that spirit, I would now like to introduce Rabbi Michael Lotger, the Ventura Federation Community Rabbi, and this evening's moderator, as he welcomes J.J. Goldberg and Jonathan Tobin in debate.
Thank you, Sherry. It is a great honor to be here and to be moderating this august panel. I will introduce the panelists and, well, first I'll say a word about how this is going to function. There are four questions, no allusion to Pesach intended, that we have agreed to discuss. Each of the panelists will discuss the question for 4 minutes each, and then each will have a 2-minute rebuttal, and then we'll move on to the next question. If there are questions from the audience, you will see at the bottom of your screen a window that says Q&A. And so if you have questions, as you have them, just type them in. I will be keeping an eye on them. And then at the very end of our discussion, we will have sometime about 15 or 20 minutes, I think, for questions and answers. So now let me introduce the panelists. J.J. Goldberg is Editor Emeritus and Senior Commentator at the Jewish Daily Forward. He was the Forward's Editor-in-Chief from 2000 to 2007. In the past, he has served as the U.S. Bureau Chief of the Jerusalem Report and Managing Editor of New York Jewish Week. His books include Jewish Power Inside the American Jewish Establishment, which was listed by the Philadelphia Inquirer among the most 100 important books of 1996, as well as Builders and Dreamers, A History of Labor Zionism in America. Before entering journalism, he worked as an education specialist with the World Zionist Organization in Jerusalem, a founding member and Secretary General of Kibbutz Gezer in Tel Aviv, and a New York City cab driver. He has been a sharpshooter with the Israeli Border Police Civil Guard, a member of the Central Committee of the United Kibbutz Movement, and a member of the Pulitzer Prize jury. Jonathan Tobin is the Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, an international wire service covering the Jewish world and Israel. He is also a columnist for the New York Post, National Review, Newsweek, The Federalist, Haaretz, and Israel Hayom, as well as writing for other publications such as the Washington Examiner and Commentary Magazine. In his writing, he covers on a daily basis the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S.-Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, and the Jewish world. Prior to becoming editor of JNS, Mr. Tobin was executive editor and then later senior online editor and chief political blogger for Commentary magazine. Prior to that, he was editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, and before that, the editor of the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. Mr. Tobin has won more than 50 awards for his writing, including being named top columnist for Jewish publications 10 times, including 2018 and 2019. He appears regularly on television, commenting on politics in the United States and Israel, foreign policy, and Jewish affairs, and lectures on college campuses and to Jewish communities. Mr. Tobin was born in New York City, attended local schools, and studied history at Columbia University. We will be having the first question, which is as follows. Have President Trump's policies been good for Israel? Should his vigorous support for Israel override other concerns Jewish voters might have about his presidency? Would a Joe Biden administration revert back to the Obama-era policies toward the Palestinians about the necessity of a two-state solution, as well as on Iran? Or could he reestablish a bipartisan consensus on Israel that was already starting to erode before Trump? And I will invite Mr. Tobin to begin.
Thank you. Good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you to the 13 participating Jewish federations, JCCs, and synagogues for inviting us to speak to you today. And now that the holidays are over, I want to wish you a Shana Tova, to everyone for a happy, healthy 5781. Only a month after normalization agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain were signed at the White House, questioning whether the Trump administration is good for Israel isn't so much inaccurate as it is silly. Say what you will about Trump, but it is a simple fact that his has been the most pro-Israel administration in the history of the relationship between the two countries. The list of Trump's decisions in the last 3.5 years bears witness to the fact that he has prioritized good relations with Israel, promoted sensible, realistic policies, and to the chagrin of many of his Jewish opponents, actually done more to advance the cause of peace and security than his predecessors. Moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, demanding accountability from the Palestinian Authority for its financial support of terrorism, and withdrawing from the dangerous Iran nuclear deal, which not only legalized Tehran's nuclear program, but with its sunset clauses, made it inevitable that it would get a weapon with Western approval. Any one of those policies would in and of itself justify the claims of Trump's supporters that he's good for Israel. Taken together, they make a good case that, at least as far as Israel is concerned, his presidency has been a historic high point for the alliance. That he did these things is something to cheer even if you don't like it, but it's more important to ask how and why it happened. Trump is accused of being erratic, but on Israel he's been anything but. Trump's skepticism of experts and establishment thinking can often get him into trouble. But with regard to Israel, it served him well because the experts, the foreign policy establishment that have been guiding US policy in the Middle East have been dead wrong for decades. Trump and his foreign policy team looked at the deadlock in the peace process and not only rejected President Obama's belief in the idea that more daylight between the two allies was necessary, but that it was time to reject the conventional wisdom that upheld 3 myths. One was the myth that the conflict with the Palestinians was the key to all problems of the Middle East. The second was that Israel could not have better relations with the Arab world until it created a Palestinian state. And third, and most importantly, that Israel needed to be saved from itself. A two-state solution may be, in theory, the most rational way to end the conflict, but the Palestinians have made it clear by repeatedly rejecting offers of an independent state in peace, they are still locked into the mindset of a 100-year-old war against Zionism that has made it impossible for them to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state no matter where its borders are drawn. That's why there is a consensus that stretches from the center left to the right in Israeli society that believes there is no viable partner for peace. Some American Jews may disagree with that consensus, but if, as they claim to, they support Israeli democracy, then they should respect the right of the Israeli people to make their own decisions, even if it means that the solution is not in sight, and accepting that most Israelis believe that repeating Ariel Sharon's disastrous experiment in Gaza, in which the withdrawal of every Israeli soldier, settler, and settlement led not to peace, but to the creation of a terrorist state. And to do it in the far larger and more strategic West Bank would not be so much unwise as insane. You can disagree with that, but Israel does not need to be saved from itself, and those who claim that this is their goal are wrong. Trump didn't wind up brokering the ultimate deal with the Palestinians, but that happened because they aren't interested in one. But by helping to support the desire of moderate Arab nations who now look to Israel as an ally against an Iran that was enriched and empowered by Obama's appeasement, he has helped forge peace agreements that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. That is something that should be celebrated, not dismissed because you disagree with him about other issues. And it happened because he and his team were right about the Middle East and the so-called experts were wrong.
Thank you. Right on time. And I will ask J.J. Goldberg to address the same question.
If President Trump were really a good friend of Israel, he would not have withdrawn from Syria and left that vital field to the Russians and the Iranians. At this point, whether Israel can operate in Syria, as it needs to from time to time, against the Iranian and other terrorist groups, is really up to Putin. Now, these days, Netanyahu speaks almost as often to Putin as he does to Trump, because Putin holds the ground that way over there. The second issue where Trump could have been a friend to Israel but was not, was in backing away from what Obama did, which was to reestablish America's credibility in the Arab world, which had been lost under George Bush in the invasion of Iraq, so that America could serve as an honest broker and bring the sides together rather than standing with Israel in magnificent solitude and leaving the world to go its own way. A friend of Israel would be working to help Israel make peace with its neighbors. Now, is peace possible? The Arab states in 2002 issued something called the Arab Peace Initiative. It offered Israel full recognition and normal relations with all of the Arab states in return for Israel allowing a Palestinian state along the 67 borders or near them, and a solution that was just and agreed between the two sides for the refugee problem. The agreed solution to the refugee problem has actually been negotiated. They're not that far apart. The deal is possible. Israel has not gone along with it because the Netanyahu government, which has been in power for most of the last 15 years, has not wanted to withdraw from the West Bank and does not believe in a Palestinian state. The fact that Israel was able to make relations with United Arab Emirates and Bahrain looks less like a turning point in the Arab world and more like a Hail Mary pass from the Saudis, who wanted to. Israel has not agreed up until now to take the step of allowing a Palestinian state on the chance that the Arabs will keep their word and offer Israel full peace. So now they're getting some of the goodies in advance of the deal to woo them in. And the thought that the rest of the Arab world is now going to follow suit, the Saudis have been saying over and over again, not until the Arab Peace Initiative is resolved. The Moroccans have been saying over and over again, not until the Arab Peace Initiative is accepted and implemented. The Palestinians are arguing with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis over whether the Arab Peace Initiative guaranteeing Israel peace and security in return for the Arab-Palestinian state, whether that deal can be made without holding off. In other words, by breaking ranks and offering Israel some of the goodies before the deal, they feel they've been betrayed. And they made it very clear. What you've done by making peace with Israel now is betrayed the Arab Peace Initiative, in which we will guarantee Israel peace in return for what we demand in return. So the deal is on the table. The idea that the Palestinians don't want peace is about as true as the Palestinian notion that the Israelis don't want peace. Each side says horrible things about the other side. Each side is convinced that if you say horrible things about me, that means you're not going to make peace with me. Each side doesn't like the other side, resents what the other side has done to it. But ultimately, there is an interest on both sides in laying down their arms and getting along somehow with a high wall in between them.
Thank you. So we'll ask Jonathan for a 2-minute rebuttal and then back to JJ.
Well, a few points. I was critical of Trump's withdrawal from Syria, but we have to recognize a couple of basic facts. The United States hasn't fully withdrawn from Syria, but the notion that the United States can resolve Syria by itself is a myth. And the notion that Trump's move caused the sky to fall was also a myth. The situation is something that the United States can't solve by itself, or really in convention with anybody else. This was a situation that existed before Trump. President Obama abandoned Syria to the Russians and to the Assad and the Iranians. That's something that Trump has sort of given up on, and it's hard to argue with that at this point. As far as the Arab Peace Initiative, let's be honest, it's been rendered obsolete by the agreement of Bahrain and United Arab Emirates with the approval of the Saudis and to the cheers of Jordan and Egypt. The Sunni Arab world has given up on the Palestinians. I mean, the only people who haven't apparently are some people on the Israeli left or the Jewish left. They are sick of Palestinian intransigence. They understand that the Palestinians simply are not capable, that their national identity is still intrinsically tied to this war on Israel that even the moderates can't give up. And that's the basic obstacle. To say that the Palestinians want peace as much as the Israelis is just, it flies in the face of facts. They have repeatedly rejected peace agreements, and it is not, as my friend JJ says, just a series of unfortunate circumstances, assassinations, governments fell. If Netanyahu has been in power for the last 11 years, it's because the Palestinians keep re-electing him, because a consensus within Israeli society has held that there is no peace partner. And for American Jews to claim, well, no, you're wrong, is absurd. The Israelis understand the situation. The last 3 elections that were fought in Israel, which were very bitterly fought, had nothing to do with the peace process because there's a consensus on the peace process. They were about Netanyahu and other issues. So the idea that there is, a peace deal on the table, that it's only Israel has to say yes, it's quite the opposite. It's the Palestinians who have to give up, to have a sea change in their politics that will enable them to say yes. And we hope we live to see it, but right now it's not in the offing.
JJ?
There are a few fallacious ways of thinking that we often fall into. One is to say, if you can't fix everything, then you can't fix anything. The notion that America is not responsible for everything that happens to Syria and can't save the whole situation is of course true. But America could have refrained from withdrawing its troops and abandoning the Kurds, America's best allies in Syria, to the tender mercies of the Turks. But Trump wanted to pull American troops out of Syria, and he did. He wouldn't have kept Syria in some sort of tip-top shape if he'd left the troops there. He would have not made it worse, which is what it became. The other fallacious idea is that if the Palestinians didn't buy the offers that Israel made over the years under Rabin, under Barak, under Ehud Olmert, then that proves they don't want peace. The fact is that under Rabin, under Barak, and under Ehud Olmert, there have been negotiations which have made steady progress, a little bit under Rabin, further under Barak, and further under Olmert, so that both Olmert and Abbas agreed they were only a few weeks or a few months away from a final deal. In each case, Rabin was assassinated, Barak lost his coalition and had to go to elections, and Arafat, of course, undermined him in the elections by starting the Second Intifada. And the Olmert was indicted. So each prime minister, after laying an offer on the table, was removed from office before the other side could make a counteroffer. There has been progress. They're not that far away. And it's always been based on the Arab Peace Initiative. Now, 2 other points are, yes, the Israeli people have, well, the Israeli people, more people voted for parties that wanted Netanyahu out than parties that wanted Netanyahu in the last 3 elections. Netanyahu lost the last 3 elections. The problem is that the opposition can't form a coalition because 15 of its 62 seats belong to Arab parties that several on the Jewish side don't want to sit with.
Please
so
wrap up.
coalition becomes incorporated. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. And we are getting a bunch of interesting questions. The second question for our panelists, with JJ going first, is, should the Jewish community ally itself with the Black Lives Matter movement? Is the obligation to Jews to stand with those protesting racism as previous generations have done? Or do the radical views of BLM activists about Israel and other issues and their actions mean that Jews should not tie themselves to this movement? JJ?
Well, again, fallacies that we take as truth. In the same way, that the Israelis believe that they're under constant terrorist attack. Terrorism basically ended. It was 200 a month during the Intifada, and it's been 7 or 8 a month since then, pretty consistently. All of the rockets from Gaza have only caused a handful of casualties, 7 or 8 over the 15, I think, over the years. Because there are rockets and because Israelis never recovered from the second Intifada, there is still this notion that there's constant terrorism, and there isn't. It is way down. In the same way, the Black Lives Matter movement is actually 2 organizations. One is a very loose confederation or association of organizations that call themselves Black Lives Matter, which take no position on anything other than Black Lives Matter, other than police brutality as they see it. The other side is the Movement for Black Lives, MBL, which is a small organization that piggybacks and hitchhikes on the reputation of the Black Lives Matter movement and did adopt a lengthy platform which included something about Israeli genocide, which it then dropped 2 years ago because it was embarrassing itself. So this notion that the Black Lives Matter movement is essentially somehow a threat to Jews or an anti-Semitic movement or even an anti-Israel movement just isn't so. There are people in that movement who don't like Israel, who are openly hostile to Israel, but the movement is not, most of its members are not, and there is no reason for the Jewish community not to stand side, but not to ally itself. It's a movement of Black community to help itself. They don't want somebody else to join them, but other people of goodwill can stand alongside them, support the goals, and say, as an obvious truth, yes, Black Lives Matter. So the idea that we exaggerate and build on myths, Black Lives Matter movement is anti-Semitic because there was a smaller movement with a similar name. It's the same pattern of getting stuck in a fallacy that was true or seemed true at a certain point and never letting go of it. The last thing is, when people say they don't like us, we say, listen to them. They mean every word. Remember what happened under Hitler. When people say they want to get along, Palestinians say, we recognize Israel as they did ever since '88 and have never taken it back. We say, oh, they're lying. If they don't like us, we assume it's true. If they say they do like us, we assume that they're tricking us somehow. It's not a healthy way to be in the world, and it's not a productive way to conduct your business.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Tobin.
We all know that racism exists in this country and that it is part of our history as a nation. Wherever it exists, it should be exposed and vigorously opposed. As Jews, our values and our history align us on the side of those who have experienced discrimination. So when we hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, we instinctually react with support. However, that expression is at one and the same time an anodyne phrase that no decent or reasonable person could oppose, as well as a movement that not only brings in its train ideas and proposed policies that range from the questionable to the outrageous, but also a way of thinking about America that is antithetical to both the truth about the broad strokes of our history and the liberal values that have made it both the freest nation on earth, as well as the place where Jews have uniquely thrived. The vast majority of Americans support the idea that police brutality and racial bias must not be tolerated. But the movement that took to the streets this past summer in mostly peaceful protests nevertheless led to hundreds of riots is based on a fundamental misconception, not only about law enforcement in this country, in which the myth that police are hunting down and murdering unarmed innocent Blacks is believed despite the absence of statistical proof, but also about the nature of American society. Much like the New York Times 1619 Project, a historically inaccurate attempt to recast our view of the past to make us believe that not only were America's beginnings problematic in many ways, but that the essence of our national identity is irredeemably racist. It's not merely mistaken, but falsified so as to diminish our support for the basic principles of a liberal society. It aims not so much to tear down statues, but tear down the fabric of our faith and liberty that is essential to American identity and law. The BLM movement that has taken up this farce charge and turned it into a rallying cry for policies and practices that aren't merely radical, but antithetical to the rule of law and to liberal values. Instead of taking race out of the law, BLM and the related effort to impose critical race theory and intersectionalism on American society is determined to make race the center of every conversation. Its goal is not to fulfill the vision of the civil rights movement in which we will be judged by the content of our character and not the content of color of our skin, but to alter it to one in which pseudo-intellectual concepts like white fragility govern our discourse. Just as important, it is inextricably linked to conspiracy theories about white privilege, in which Jews are treated as one more example of colonial oppressors and a cancel culture of virtue signaling bullies that is not only illiberal, but also fundamentally opposed to the principle of free speech. Where do Jews come into this equation? Those groups who purport to represent us are always on firm ground in supporting equality and opposing discrimination. But the BLM movement, in its various forms, takes us into territory in which we are not merely signing on to policies that are antithetical to Jewish security, such as those reflecting decreased policing, but also this movement is linked to intersectional myths that are directly connected to anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic ideas and movements that Jews are obligated to oppose. One can oppose injustice without being co-opted into a movement that has countenanced mob violence and is also incompatible with support for Israel, but also the values of a society in which Jews and other minorities have thrived. Those who link us to this trend, either because they believe it is in the interests of the party loyalty and partisanship, but also in the name of old alliances with moderate partners that have been replaced by extremists, are doing neither this country nor the Jewish community any good.
Thank you. JJ, a response.
I don't hardly know where to begin, but let me start by saying the notion that standing with Black Lives Matter means buying into the 1619 Project, or buying into the notion that America is irredeemably racist, or buying into the concept of abolishing the police, or buying into the concept of intersecting with Palestinian goals of destroying Israel. These aren't the Black Lives Matter movement. What they are is people who use the name in order to advance ideas that they had already. The hundreds of thousands of people who have marched through the streets of our cities in the last 2 years in the name of Black Lives Matter, most of them never heard of intersectionality or critical race theory. They don't know what it is, and they'd laugh if they did understand what it was. What they are is in favor of is training American law enforcement to stop discriminating. Now, I don't know what it's like to wake up in the morning and wonder whether my kids are going to be okay walking to school. I don't know what that's like. I understand that for many, many Black families, in fact, for most, apparently there's been this outpouring from middle class, from moderate, from even conservative Black families that are saying, finally, somebody is recognizing that we have the police, we have much to fear from the police. As a white person, the police seem to me as my protectors. In fact, when my kids were little, I used to take them to the police station in order to make friends with the cops so they'd grow up understanding that cops aren't bad people. On the Upper West Side, you need to say that. But the idea that the movement is about abolishing the police, that it's all about the 200 or 250 Black men who are killed by police every year, and I don't know how many of them were actually unarmed, probably half, as opposed to, by the way, the 5,000 or 6,000 young Black men who are killed every year by other young Black men. This has captured the imagination of the Black community as a way of advancing and releasing a certain amount of fear that they live with every day, which makes them feel probably more oppressed than the economics of the situation show. And there's no reason not to stand in solidarity with that sentiment.
Thank you. Again, lots of interesting questions coming in, and we have about almost 430 screens tuned in. Moving on to the third question for, sorry?
I think I'm entitled to my 2-minute rebuttal. No?
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that. Sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay. I think we all stand with the anodyne statement that Black Lives Matter. Of course, Black Lives Matter. But what's been at issue in these past months as the issues have unfolded is much more than that anodyne statement or the natural sympathy and support that we all feel for African Americans who feel threatened by police or by racism wherever it comes. But what has happened is that it has brought to the fore, these aren't merely isolated voices or people who have nothing to do with this movement or spokesman. It is intrinsically linked to, and I think this goes back to our first questions, to a sort of radical wing of American politics that does believe in intersectionalism. You know, we didn't get to talking about partisanship on Israel, but part of the problem is that the two parties have flipped. They've exchanged identities over the last 50 or 60 years, in which the Democrats, who were once the lockstep pro-Israel party, became, thanks to the influence of the intersectional left, deeply divided about Israel, while Republicans, who were once divided on Israel, are now the lockstep pro-Israel party. And we have to understand that these radical voices have a lot of influence. They are not merely just, you know, crazy people on the internet. They have, you know, a strong point. That's why the question of critical race theory and white fragility, the best-selling, you know, pseudo-intellectual, you know, movement, which is driving so many companies and even the government to start these training sessions that are really antithetical to equality, antithetical to combating racism. They're rooted in a kind of racism. That's why we can't ignore it. We have to speak up against it and against the cancel culture that is related to it. That is, as I said, antithetical to the rights of all individuals and of free speech. That can't be allowed to go to be subsumed by merely the fact that we care about racism. Of course we do, but we have to fight a movement that is largely dominated by these negative forces.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving on to the third question. Is there a Jewish stake in the battle over the confirmation of a replacement for the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Are Jews obligated to support the liberal wing on the court because of issues like abortion, immigration, and health care? Or is it a mistake for those who claim to represent the Jewish community in what is, for all intents and purposes, a partisan battle, and in which the left seems to be expressing hostility to both people of faith and religious liberty? Jonathan.
Right now, America is deeply divided about politics and the presidential race, and one of the most divisive issues is the Supreme Court. Nominations to the court are divisive in a way that they weren't in previous generations for a clear reason. The growth of the High Court's importance is a function of the increased power of the administrative state and the executive branch and the inability of Congress, no matter which party controls it, to act as a check on it. The Supreme Court has, alas, become a super legislature. That's why bruising court confirmation fights, which were once rare, are now a given no matter how qualified the nominee. Not without justification, Democrats are screaming about Republican hypocrisy because of what happened in 2016 with Judge Merrick Garland. But neither side's 2016 arguments stand very well up now, as even the New York Times opinion section pointed out recently. All the arguments that made by the Republicans then about the inadmissibility of an election year confirmation are being used today by the Democrats, and Republicans are recycling the Democrats' four-year-old arguments demanding that the Senate do its job and act on a president's nominee. The hypocrisy is universal, and both parties ought to admit that this is about power and not a principled debate about process. This is something that those who claim to represent the broad interests of the Jewish community need to remember before they dive headfirst into partisan brawls and say that they are doing so in the name of the Jewish community. Just as some Jews who say they don't believe Trump's stand on Israel should determine their votes and other issues matter more, so too does the fact that Jews are liberals and view issues that fall under the rubric of social justice as determinative doesn't necessarily mean that all Jews need to engage in partisan wars at the moment. It's an old joke, and one that is actually unfair, to say that the non-Orthodox or Reform Judaism is merely a Democratic Party platform with holidays thrown in. But no matter what denomination you are or party you affiliate with, we should always differentiate between those interests that are specifically Jewish priorities and those that engage our individual beliefs as American citizens. nor should we allow the fact that Jews regard abortion very differently as a matter of religious law to turn that debate into a religious war in which Jews are aligned against those who oppose it as a matter of faith. That doesn't mean we aren't entitled to our opinions and to express them strongly, but the notion that this is a specifically Jewish issue is a perilous limb to venture out onto, even if the majority of us are clearly on one side of it. It is also important to bear in mind that among the most important issues facing the court in recent years are those related to preservation and protection of our First Amendment rights to free exercise of religion. Part of that debate takes the form of efforts to denigrate or repress those conservative Christians whose beliefs are very different from that of most Jews. The question here is not so much whether liberal Jews will oppose Judge Amy Coney Barrett because they despise Trump or are ardent advocates of abortion rights. But if, as has been the case with so many Jewish groups, they are indifferent to the rights of conservative Christians to practice their faith in the public square, rather than only in the privacy of their homes, this cribbed version of the First Amendment also poses a potential threat to Jews. The notion that the rights of others to religious expression or autonomy should be abridged because we view our issues like abortion or gay rights that should supersede them is unacceptable, no matter how much we care about those issues. The problem is that a willingness on the part of many Jews to defend religious freedom seems only to extend to those who think or believe as we do. Instead of defending the First Amendment rights of religious minorities, they think that they should be abrogated. That Jews have little sympathy for Christian conservatives whose beliefs are seen as threatening to liberal ideas is unsurprising. But rights are not supposed to exist just for our friends and us. They must apply to everyone or they're meaningless. Religious freedom for me, but not for thee, is not a sentiment that is consistent with the Constitution or the long-term interests of the American Jews. Jews may not support Amy Coney Barrett, but if they don't criticize attempts to impose religious tests or expressions of contempt for her faith, they will be undermining the case for their rights too.
Thank you. And JJ.
To begin with, the notion that in opposing the movement to the right of the church, of the Supreme Court, I'm sorry, and the advancement of the views of the Christian right is somehow anti-religious freedom is simply fallacious. When what the Christian right is demanding is the right to impose its values on everybody else, rather than leaving the public square neutral so that all religions can practice their faith at home and tussle in the public square about political issues rather than opposing each other's faith. But when you come forward and you say it is immoral for the entire nation to practice, for example, to permit abortion, and abortion should be made as close to impossible as possible, you're imposing your views on Judaism, which, by the way, in many circumstances requires abortion. If it's in danger to the mother's life or to the mother's mental health, by most interpretations, most Orthodox interpretations, you have to let the mother abort in order to let her continue with her life. This is not recognized. And one time that this was tried in a legislative arena was in 1990, when the Louisiana state legislature proposed a law banning all abortions under any circumstances, anytime. The Jewish community and the Board of Rabbis in New Orleans sent the chairman of the Board of Rabbis to Baton Rouge to testify about Judaism's stake in this. And he said, look, under Judaism, life is an evolving thing. It's the Talmud teaches the first 30 days it's a drop of bodily fluid, and so on. It's an organ of the body. During the break for lunch, reporters asked the chairman of the committee, who was also the sponsor of the bill, what happened that morning. And he said, we heard from a religion that believes in killing babies. So our right to practice our religion is at stake in the fight to keep the public square neutral. I think it was Irving Kristol. Yes, it was Irving Kristol, because I discussed it with him after that. In August of 1991, in Commentary magazine, wrote about his view as they called him the godfather of neoconservatism, that the American life was losing any sense of moral anchor and was drifting amorally because of the loss of religious values. And it was time for America to re-embrace its Christian tradition, even if Jews would, to some extent, be ghettoized and excluded. That was an okay price. Now, whether the Jewish community speaking in the name of the Jews, should represent the majority of Jews on some matters that Jews strongly believe in, and many Jews believe as an expression of their Judaism, I don't understand what the question is. Jews should, when we elect a government, the government does what it believes and what it said it was going to do, whether or not we believe in it, and we still pay taxes. When we support institutions to speak in our name, they are going to do what most of us believe. And the idea, it's been basically since the 1990s, I think, well, since Newt Gingrich made opposition a matter of moral level, that you're not fighting with the opponents, you're defeating evil. And so the other side has to be evil, and therefore you don't allow the other side to express what it wants. It's been a standard in the conservative wing of the Jewish community to say, well, you may believe all that stuff, but we should only be talking about Israel, or only talking about anti-Semitism, in my interpretation of anti-Semitism, and drop the whole Jewish community agenda because I don't like it. 90% of Jews believe in abortion. About 50% of Jews believe that Israel is the center of Jewish life. And when you ask Jews in surveys over and over again what issues motivate them to vote, 50%, 55% say the economy, 20% say national security, and 5 or 6% say Israel is the main issue.
Please wrap up.
Jews have a right to have their opinions too, and they have a right to have the organizations that represent them.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I think the notion that issues about which Jews as individuals feel very strongly should be therefore Jewish issues, as opposed to issues that are directly related to Jewish security, like anti-Semitism and the survival of Israel, and be on an equal plane with them, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. As I say, if you think Judaism is, the Democratic Party, well, knock yourself out. That's fine, but that's not really a way to preserve a Jewish community. The truth is, most Americans are in the mushy middle on abortion. They don't want to see it be ruled completely illegal, but they believe in restrictions. They believe in ideas like parental consent. This issue is driven by the extremes, and within the Jewish community, it's driven by the extremes as well. And I think when that becomes, the representative Jewish view, it certainly represents a great many liberal Jews, but it does not represent all of American Jewry, and that's a problem. As far as Jews being ghettoized and sort of American liberals being ghettoized, that's a very antiquated concept. The people who are being ghettoized are conservative Christians who have been basically left behind on issues like gay marriage and and other sort of other issues. They want to be left alone, and indeed, some of the left won't leave them alone. They won't let them practice their faith. They want to compel them to pay for, abortion-inducing drugs. This is where the First Amendment comes in. It's not easy. It's not just, it can't be just about us and what we think and what offends our sensibilities. We have to understand that religious liberty is about those with whom we disagree with, just as free speech is not just defending speech with which we agree. That's easy. It's defending the rights of people with whom we disagree. And that's the point here. And when we fall into a mindset that sort of a liberal social justice agenda, which many people support, majority of Jews who clearly vote on issues that are not specifically Jewish, that should determine our community response in every respect, just because it's a majority vote. Well, it may represent that majority, but it does not represent really what the long-term interests of a Jewish community are, which has to focus on religious liberty, has to focus on anti-Semitism and defense of Israel.
Thank you. And JJ.
Well, as I said, trying to limit what the Jewish community as a collectivity can talk about is exactly what you want to do if you don't like what most Jews think. Furthermore, the Torah, if you read it, talks once, fairly briefly, about dietary rules. It's got a lot of references to the Shabbat, with 2 moments where it describes exactly what it means by Shabbat. There are dozens and dozens of references to equal judging of the rich and poor, fair judgment, fair treatment of the poor, rights of workers to get their wages on time, the rights. In other words, there are many values in the Torah, which are values of Judaism, if we believe in the Torah, that are not about anti-Semitism, fighting our enemies, or defending Israel. In fact, many good Jews, the Satmar Hasidim, who are the largest Hasidic movement in the world, don't believe there should be a Jewish state because the Messiah hasn't come. They're not bad Jews. All of the issues that we talk about are in dispute. The question is, can you have governance in the Jewish community in America? In America, if I don't like what well, let's say if a Christian rightist who's permitted to not have abortion, nobody's making them have abortions. But if they don't like the idea of paying taxes that cover abortion because they object to abortion, then I should have the right not to pay the portion of my taxes that went for the war in Iraq, because I objected to the war in Iraq, to the war in Vietnam. You don't get to do that. When you have a system of governance, you have a certain compulsion. If you lose a vote, you lose a vote. Then you try again the next time to win the vote. There is no issue here of religious liberty, because it's not a religious liberty for them to tell me how to live my life. It is religious liberty for me to decide how I want to live. And it is also religious liberty for the Jewish community to act in the name of the Jewish community on the values that it holds dear and that it can trace back to the Torah.
Please wrap up.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you. And our fourth question is about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has become an even greater concern for American Jews in recent years. Which represents a greater threat to Jewish security, the white nationalist right or the progressive left? Is one political party more responsible than the other for the spread of hate and the politicization of the issue? And we will begin with JJ.
It's actually a pretty easy question to answer. The FBI itself will tell you that the main threat of terrorist violence and bigotry in America today is the far right. There are threats. Far right massacred the Jews in Pittsburgh. Far right attempted to kill as many Jews as it could in Poway, California. Over the last, to be fair, over the last 40 years, I did a count incident by incident, and before the Pittsburgh massacre, the number of incidents and the number of Jews killed was roughly equally divided between Muslims and far right. Leftists, American leftists who were not Muslim, and most Muslims who do this are not leftists, they're conservative Muslims, but the left has barely touched the surface in terms of violence against Jews. It's just not an issue. Many of the people on the left are Jewish. They don't like Israel. And they strongly disagree with Israel. Many of them just don't like Israeli policy, and they'll take their allies where they can get it. But the notion that because there's a political dispute over Israel, which is turning, by the way, into an ugly and identitarian dispute over the rights of Jews to have their own independent state, the Palestinians grow in strength and popularity abroad, the more that Israel hangs on to the territories, builds settlements, and closes the door to the option of Palestinian sovereignty and independence. So that to say that the left is our enemy is essentially to guarantee that it will be by refusing to make concessions and refusing to recognize the political aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian debate. So that the question is actually fairly plain. There are many people on the left, and it's not united, who disagree, who don't like the state of Israel. It's not about Jews, it's about the state of Israel. And there are many people on the right who really hate Jews. And the number on the right who hate Jews is growing. The idea of white nationalism, of white survival, of white genocide, this is growing popular. It has gained momentum under Trump, although people blame Trump too much for something that's been going on for half a century. Finally, the notion that opposing Israel is by its nature anti-Semitism, because Israel is the only Jewish state, ignores the fact that Israel is the only state, for example, that has its capital on turf that no other country in the world, now the Trump administration, recognizes as its own territory. Jerusalem was left to be negotiated. Both sides agreed to negotiate it. Israel has claimed it as itself, as its own. But Tony Judt, the historian, once called Israel and Zionism an anachronism. What he meant, he was roasted up and down for being an anti-Semite for saying that. In fact, what he meant, and he told me this explicitly, America Canada, Australia, and New Zealand founded their nations on territory that had been somebody else's. At the time that they did it, it was legitimate to exterminate inferior races, quote unquote. When the Jews got around to it, and we did it, we didn't exterminate. We just claimed sovereignty and dealt with the fact that many people fled. But it was a time when it was no longer acceptable to establish yourself on the ground that somebody else claimed. By the way, the person who first recognized this in Zionism was Vladimir Jabotinsky, the grandfather of what's now the Likud. He's the one who said it is natural for the Arabs of Palestine to oppose us because no nation in the world, no people, no population, no tribe has ever welcomed another population to come in and turn their territory into its own territory. And that's why we have to remain strong until they come around.
Please
now
wrap
that
up.
they turn around, there is what to talk about. But as long as you hold out and say, no, it's all ours, and you people have nothing to say, you're going to increase the hostility. And that's what's happening around the world. The populations around, the Palestinians are gaining popularity on the ground. And finally, Israel has the advantage on the ground in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. The Palestinians have the advantage on the street around the world. It's a political truth. There are more Arab states than there are Israel. There's
Okay,
more Muslims
please wrap up.
There you go.
Thank you. And Jonathan.
It's possible for the Jewish people to walk and chew gum at the same time. Obviously, white supremacy, the far right, is a danger to the Jewish people. It's a danger to civil society. It's a danger to all Americans. At the same time, anti-Semitism from the left is a danger to the Jewish people. It's possible for us to condemn and oppose both and to be sane, serious, and sober about both threats. There is no question that many people underestimated the far right and discounted the way that some isolated portions of it can become violent and created massacres, as we said, in Pittsburgh and Poway. But let's also not exaggerate this threat. They are numerically quite small, and they have very little influence in politics and in our public square. They're universally condemned, even though President Trump has sometimes stumbled over repeating his condemnations. There's no question but that they are isolated and numerically small. On the other hand, the anti-Semitism of the left, while not as violent, is still far larger in terms of its numbers. Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam have hundreds of thousands of members and sympathizers and supporters. The far left of the Democratic Party, who buy into intersectional arguments and anti-Zionism, they also are dabbling and practicing anti-Semitism. And let's make a very clear point about the BDS movement, the movement to boycott, divest, and sanction against Israel. At its heart, it is intrinsically anti-Semitic. There's no doubt about this. When you seek to deny to Jews that which you don't deny to other peoples, you are practicing a form of discrimination against Jews. And as the lawyers say, the term of art for such discrimination is anti-Semitism. That is a clear point, and we know that, not just because I'm saying so, but because wherever the BDS movement raises its banners, its efforts, follow acts of intimidation, sometimes violence, and to shun and isolate Jewish students, especially on college campus, always follow. That's the clear point here. It is functionally anti-Semitic. And while its origins were in just merely economic warfare against Israel, and some people give them credit, well, at least instead of terrorism and wars, they gave up the tactics that didn't work to destroy the Jewish state. Now they just want economic warfare. Well, of course, that's failed. BDS hasn't laid a glove on Israel and its startup first world economy. Its real goal now is American Jewry. It's about isolating us. And it's about causing Jews, young Jews, to feel that they have to disavow Israel and disavow Zionism and their connection to the Jewish people in order to remain legitimate, be part of enlightened liberal society. We have to stand up against this. To claim that we have to accept it or that it's just not fashionable, that doesn't work. If there is any issue that should unite us, it should be this one against BDS. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not liberal, it's not conservative. What it is a threat to the Jewish people, to our community, to our ability to exist. And holding on to myths about that it's really Israel's fault doesn't advance us, it doesn't help protect us, it actually only enables those forces that are trying to silence Jews, practicing anti-Semitism, and doing it in such a way as to silence the entire Jewish community. We cannot let that happen. We must stand up united against it.
Thank you. JJ.
You can get really worked out about threats. If it hasn't laid a glove on Israel, then there shouldn't be a problem. If it weren't a problem for Israel, Israel would not have set up a Ministry of Strategic Affairs primarily concerned with fighting BDS. When British trade unions decide to boycott Israel, that's not about American Jews. That's about Israel and what it's doing. For many on the left, they adopt BDS because they want Israel to stop existing, although how a boycott is going to destroy a country is not clear at all. Boycott can't capture territory. A terrorist organization can't capture territory. We boycotted South Africa. Nobody claimed that it was bigotry. We boycotted the Soviet Union. We boycotted France when it turned against Israel after the Six-Day War. Boycotts are a form of political expression. When somebody starts a boycott against us, of course we will fight it. We will resist it. We can note in passing, not even in passing, we should bear in mind that when BDS was declared by Palestinian civil society organizations, by the NGO wing of the PLO 5-6 years ago, 7 years ago, it was a declaration to end Israel's occupation post-1967. It wasn't about the existence of Israel. Many people around the world have taken it up as a banner because they hate Israel and they may even hate Jews. But it is not an issue of life or death for anybody. It is an issue, and let me agree with Jonathan on one point. Besides the walk and chew gum about opposing anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, which I absolutely agree with. They are both a problem, and Farrakhan is wildly underestimated as a problem. But when we talk about, you know what? I don't remember what I was going to say. Let me drop it here.
Welcome to our world. Jonathan.
Let me pick up where JJ left off about the influence of Farrakhan. We've talked a lot about violence and which movements are really a threat and which movements are a theoretical threat to Jews. Well, in last year, there was a surge of violence against Orthodox Jews in the greater New York area from African Americans. Now, this didn't represent the views of all African Americans. Let's not exaggerate that. But what it was a sign of the acceptance of anti-Semitic ideas within the Black community. I mean, those who were quick to connect dots between Trump and groups that actually hate him and which he has condemned, but refused to connect the dots between the growing anti-Semitism in the African-American community and Farrakhan's influence, and all those who enable him. People like Tamika Mallory, just to take one name, who was one of the leaders of the Women's March that was part of the resistance against Trump and now has moved on to the Black Lives Matter movement, has become the principal spokesman in the Breonna Taylor case. These are people who are supporters of Farrakhan, supporters of anti-Semitism, and to the, we should not legitimize them, and we have to confront them. A point, also is that the idea that anti-Zionism or people criticize Israel, BDS movement, it's not just about criticizing Israel or moving its borders or criticizing Netanyahu. It's about, just read the literature of the Students for Justice in Palestine, the major movement of BDS in this country. You'll see it's about anti-Semitism and destruction of Israel. And also even those Jewish groups, Jewish groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, radical left-wingers, are now not only opposing Israel's existence, but engaging in anti-Semitism themselves, as when in their movement they seek to blame American Jews who support trips by American first responders to Israel where they get training, and say that that causes American police to kill Blacks in the streets of America's cities. This isn't just a wrong opinion, it's a traditional blood libel against Jews, and it cannot be accepted. It is outrageous. And let me just say one more thing, in that groups like that, I'm a big tent person in terms of the Jewish community, but groups like that, which are against not only the existence of Israel, but are promoting slanders and libels against Jews, must fall outside the rubric of our big Jewish tent. Otherwise, inclusion is a very important value, but when we honor only inclusion, we stand for nothing. And a community that stands for nothing is a community that cannot survive.
Thank you. I have been getting lots and lots of questions, and we have about 15 minutes for questions and answer. I have had to delete them. Some of you noticed that you've posted them. Sometimes they're repetitious, and sometimes often I am just using my judgment about questions. So I don't know what you've used as a format in the past, but let's say a minute each for responding. Okay. So let me ask actually the most recent question answered, directed to Jonathan, but certainly JJ should chime in on it as well. Are you saying that anti-Israel is anti-Semitism? So Jews who are against many of the policies and practices of the Israeli government, would you say that is anti-Semitism and in effect self-hating Jews?
Of course not. Millions of Israelis get up every morning and criticize their government, just as hundreds of millions of Americans get up every morning and criticize their government. We're not talking about criticisms of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli government, or policies of it. We're talking about people who oppose the existence of the one Jewish state on the planet. That is anti-Semitism, not opposition to Netanyahu. There's fair debate in Israel. Israel is a democracy with lots of different parties, with lots of different views. It's true that the majority are against Netanyahu. Let me just correct one point that my friend made earlier, but the majority of them don't embrace the policies that he's advocating, even those that are against Netanyahu. So that's not the point. It's kind of a false flag, a red herring there. Of course, we're entitled to criticize Israel. Both JJ and I do it all the time. That doesn't mean we're anti-Zionist or anti-Israel. But the point is, those who are against the existence of the state of Israel, they are anti-Zionist, and anti-Zionism is in practice often and almost always linked to anti-Semitism.
JJ?
You can criticize the state of Israel as long as you don't do anything about it. If you take action, if you stand in the street, if you carry a sign, if you announce a boycott, there is a movement within Israel and the Jewish community to boycott products from the settlements, because the settlements are considered widely among liberals and leftists to be an obstacle to peace, to be a deliberate attempt to permanently establish Israeli control of the West Bank and prevent a Palestinian state. You boycott the settlements. Israeli law, which has been adopted by the US Congress, says that it is illegal to practice the various forms of what it is, but they outlaw either practicing or advocating a boycott of Israel or the territories under its control. In other words, you cannot act on your opposition to the settlements. And if you do, you're going to be called an anti-Semite. If you act on your opposition, there's a strange locution that has entered Israeli dialogue and is now infecting American Jewish dialogue, which is the notion, first of all, if you object to what Israel's doing, Palestinians, do it non-violently, stop killing people. So they adopt an economic plan, so it's economic terrorism. And then they do it at the UN, so it's diplomatic terror. Terrorism is killing people.
Thank you.
Fighting against, by using political means, is politics.
Thank you. There were a couple of questions raised about Iran and about the current administration's policy of ending the of stepping out of the Iran agreement. Specifically, what are your thoughts on Trump being unable to extend the arms embargo in Iran, and what does that say about international standing of the United States under Trump? And I would add to the question, just asking for your thoughts about the relationship between Iran and Israel, and Iran's influence on the Israel status. Let's see, I guess Jonathan.
I think the point here is that the Iran nuclear deal has to be amended. It has to be changed. Everybody understands that. There are sunset clauses in it that are getting closer and closer to being triggered. That will mean that the existing sanctions will expire, and that Iran will then be free. Aside from arguments about its weakness, and the fact that it enriched Iran, and encouraged it to pursue its quest for regional hegemony, which is what has forced so much of the Arab world into Israel's arms, and have their impatience with the Palestinians. This is something that has to be changed. An American administration, whether Republican or Democratic, was going to have to address this. The notion that merely returning to the Iran nuclear deal and that that leaving it sort of destabilized the region, it's just wrong. I mean, sooner or later, a Biden administration, or what follows a Biden administration, assuming that there is a Biden administration, is going to have to address this. And the only way that it will be addressed is by imposing sanctions on Iran. And yes, much of the world is against the United States on this issue, but that doesn't mean that the world is right about this. And the fact is, both the Obama administration and Trump's critics were wrong that the United States, could not possibly impose unilateral sanctions and make the world, follow them. In fact, it has, because they have given the world a choice. You can either do business with the United States or you can do business with Iran. And like it or not, they're not choosing to do business with Iran. So Trump's policy was the right one. And whether there's a second Trump administration or a first Biden administration, that will have to be built on if we're going to eventually redo the Iran deal, as everyone knows we must.
Thank you. So I guess I'll ask you, Jonathan, to address the next question first.
We're both named Jonathan, but JJ didn't get a crack at that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to read and think and keep time at the same time. Some of us can chew gum and walk others.
Right.
Yes.
I do it in order rather than at the same time because I get messy. The idea that everybody knows what's wrong is not true. Not everybody knows that. And the idea that America can simply break open the system that has been developed at with great effort by the world community to impose as much restriction on Iran as possible, and you can just break it up, it alienates people. It makes enemies out of allies, and it makes our enemies laugh at us. They're smirking because we're doing their work for them. You can't round up NATO or the EU to join in new sanctions after you've insulted them and told them they don't count for anything and undermined their ability to work together. Now, the funny thing about Trump's withdrawal from the Iran deal is that as a result of his withdrawal and in direct response, the Iranians have returned to enriching uranium, the Iranian uranium. Does that follow? Mm-hmm. The Iranian uranium enrichment program is now in full swing, and they say they will not stop it again until we go back to, until the America rejoins the Iran deal. If the America rejoined the Iran deal in good faith and then tried to renegotiate tougher sanctions or stronger restrictions on Iranian behavior, that would be one thing, but that's not what we're doing. Finally, I've had a lot of conversations about this with heads or former heads of the Israeli army and of the Israeli intelligence with the Mossad and the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Agency. I talk to them fairly often, and they talk to me because I get what they're saying. And they say, this was a necessary deal. Yes, it kicks the can down the road 15 years, and then we have 15 years without a threat. That's how the world works. And you can't do better than to get 15 years without a threat. To move the threat up to now by simply kicking the can away and inviting the Iranians to go back to what they were doing is insane.
Thank you. So I will call JJ on you first to answer this question. And there were a couple of questions basically addressing systematic racism in the United States and books such as White Fragility, How to Be an Anti-Racist, A Father's Son, and so on. These books, so the question asserts that dismissing these books, and I guess the idea is of course behind them, is an invitation for Americans to remain ignorant of the facts of racism in this country. As Jews, we want the general public to understand anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, so we should also want Jews to be better educated about systematic racism. Please comment. So,
in principle, that is obviously true. We need to be aware of the evils of the world in all their senses, and there is system. Now, you have to differentiate between systematic racism, which means it happens over and over, and systemic racism, which is the main complaint, which means it's built into the system. The accusation of systemic racism is really, prove it to me. It hasn't really been dealt at great length. There is a feeling in the Black community that they've been shut out over and over again, that there's widespread racism. There is a sense, for example, that the Trump campaign shows you, the Trump victory shows you how much of white America is anti-Semitic. I would argue is racist. And I believe that for many voters for Trump, there were many things they like about him, and his racism, which was fairly obvious to a lot of people, was just not a deal breaker. In the same way that many Black people support Farrakhan because he stands up in a way to the man, and his anti-Semitism for them is just not a deal breaker. We should be standing on, that must be a deal breaker and that must be a deal breaker. But the final point is, when accepting the Black Revolution as a condition, as the basic premise of the Democratic Party, you're telling the majority of America, the white people of America, that they stink. You can't run a campaign that says, vote for me because you stink and I'm going to fix your rotten brain, which is essentially what the Democratic Party, or the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, is doing over and over again. And they shout over the moderate wing, which is much larger. And you want to win power so that you can advance things that you believe in and make the world better. But you can't do that by sabotaging your potential support on the other side by calling people names. And that's what we're doing right now.
Thank you, JJ. Jonathan.
Well, there was some of that that I agreed with. But I think the point here is that when you reference books like White Fragility, you're talking about pseudo-intellectual theories rooted in the idea that all Americans, no matter how liberal even they're fundamentally racist, that we are an irredeemably racist nation. This is a lie. That is not true. The United States is flawed. It was flawed at the start, but it has been on a steady arc of improving freedom and liberty. That is the basic truth of American history. And to misrepresent this, and I cited before the 1619 project of the New York Times, which is now being brought into schools as curriculums, this is absurd. And I don't say this because it's bad for the Democratic Party, which doesn't really interest me. I say because it's bad for America. And it is increasing the tone and the idea that we are a racist nation. And that just further embitters us. It doesn't get us closer to equality. It doesn't bring the races and peoples together. In fact, by definition, it drives us further apart. It is counterproductive, but also fundamentally false about what kind of a country this is. And those who harp on this, and those who try to convince us to, as my friend said, to fix your rotten brains, they're barking up the wrong tree, and they're fundamentally wrong about this nation.
Thank you. I think the last question, and I will ask Jonathan to comment first. There were a number of questions which, and you certainly can disagree with the premise of the question, that argue that if President Trump's policies have weakened American standing with the rest of the world, if America is weaker in the community of nations, isn't its support of Israel also weakened? And I guess I would also say, is the value of American support and weakened, and is the standing of Israel weakened?
Well, the short answer to that would be no. And the reason why the answer to that is no is because the United States still is, the sole superpower in this world. And, the truth is, we focus a lot on what Trump says in his tweets, but his governance has been basically conservative. He made noises about NATO, but he's actually strengthened NATO. And to go back to something my friend said before, the idea that the Iranians are laughing at us, they weren't laughing at the United States. Their economy has been brought to its knees. The Iranian people are further oppressed than ever. They have been counting on the advice they got from former Secretary of State John Kerry that just hold tight. Just wait for the Democrats to return to the nuclear deal. All the sanctions will be over, and then you'll be okay. So don't do anything crazy. We're coming to your rescue. That is, and the truth is, much of Europe wants that because they want to continue to do business with Iran, and they are insensible to the threat that Iran poses to the Middle East and to Israel. Threats to which Arab nations are much more sensible. So the idea that because Trump and you hate the orange man, you want the bad dream of 2016 to go away, that somehow that vitiates the importance of his support for Israel. Well, that's illogical. Whether you like Trump or not, what he's done on the Middle East was fundamentally right. It has made progress. It will not be wished away. Even a Biden administration, no matter what it says, it will have to build on some of the things he's done. They're not moving the embassy back to Tel Aviv, and they're not going to try to undo the progress that Israel's made in being allied with much of the Arab world, which happened because of bad policies and foolish assumptions by the Obama administration.
Thank you. JJ.
Iran didn't start being a bad player under the Obama administration. Iran has been undermining the Middle East and trying to spread itself across the Middle East since the revolution in the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Happened under Carter, it increased under Reagan, and so on down the line. They are a bad player. I didn't say that Iran was laughing at us. I said the Russians and the Chinese are laughing at us. Europeans are more worried about the Iranian nuclear project because they're in missile range. They are in missile range. The unrest that Iran stokes throughout the Middle East results in a stampede of immigrants from the Middle East into Europe, which is destabilizing European societies. So they have as much of a stake, if not more, than America does in trying to get Iran under wraps and control. And that means doing something that can dent them and not just talking about it and jumping up and down. The idea that we are Israel's friend, Israel is the only country in the world, maybe the Philippines, but certainly Israel is the best known sole country in the world where the population sympathizes with Trump more than despises him. He's very disliked in almost every country in the world except for Israel and the Philippines. Israel has made itself a pariah, has increased its unpopularity by associating itself with this person who is doing so much damage to the world community. Finally, his conservative governance of the United States includes, well, he's rolled back virtually every effort to get America's climate under control. Now, you could say, as they do, that America is belching less carbon into the air than than ever before. That's because the economy is shut down. But by shutting down one fail-safe, one department, one institution within the government after another, it is making the inevitability of a catastrophe move closer and closer. And this is widely recognized around the world. People are feeling the rising oceans. They're feeling the increased ferocity of the storms as the oceans rise and heat up the air and increase the water in the air. It's
Please wrap up.
a real threat. The fires, because the forests are drier, because the rain is less. All of these things are a threat to the world, and Trump is intentionally worsening them because he just doesn't believe in science.
Thank you. We are going to, that concludes the question and answer portion, and we're going to have a brief wrap up. And the subject of the wrap up, and I will ask JJ to begin it, is are American Jews like American, I'm sorry?
Let Jonathan go first.
Okay, Jonathan. Are American Jews like Americans in general too divided to be able to listen to each other? Or is there a way forward that can help bring us together? Tomorrow is the 101st anniversary of my late father's birth. And one of my prized possessions of his is this mug, which asserts that everyone's entitled to my opinion. And so let's see if in wrapping up, you can maybe give us hope that that mug isn't prophetic. So, Jonathan.
Well, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you to the sponsors of this evening. And thank you to everyone who logged in to listen and watch us. We live right now in what we know is a bifurcated society. And by bifurcated, I don't mean we're just divided by politics. We are deeply split by our political and cultural views. We know this. We now are a country where people do not watch, listen, or read the same media. We don't listen to each other at all. We no longer credit each other with having even good motives. We don't want to hear the other side. We cut ourselves off. We as a Jewish community do the same thing over our own particular issues, but we're also part of this general situation where people are simply at war with each other, conducting not so much an election, but a tribal culture war in which we view our opponents as fundamentally evil, not merely mistaken or wrong. This is deeply wrong. and it is making us a sick society. How do we get better? Well, I'll give you one example. Recently, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and we have been hearing a lot of tributes to her. But one aspect of her life, and though she's kind of become a cultural icon in many ways and part of the political wars as a symbol, but I'd like to remind you of the fact that she and Justice Antonin Scalia, her opposite number, the intellectual leader of the conservative group in the Supreme Court, and she, the intellectual leader of the liberals, they disagreed on just about everything. Were very fiery in their dissents and opinions in which they criticized each other's opinions. But in their own lives, they were close friends. They had a lot in common, both brilliant intellects. They shared tastes in food and opera. They're people of good musical taste from my point of view. But they understood that political combat, debates about legal and legal philosophy weren't the sum total of life. You could still be friends and understand that someone who disagreed with you had good motives, cared about the same things you did. They just went about it a different way. They just had different opinions. This is so important. What have you done for the last hour and a half, just about? We're living in a time where, as I said, the bifurcation of culture has made us so divided, and social media, Facebook, Twitter, has exacerbated that. We don't listen to other people. We delete them. We unfriend them. But what have you done for the last hour and a half? You didn't unfriend us. Maybe you wanted to, but you listened to both of us. You had to if you were going to stick with this. And you heard two people who disagree about so much, but we didn't yell at each other. We didn't call each other names. We didn't try to delegitimize each other's opinions. We listened. That's what we all must do. Relearn the ability to listen to each other, no matter how painful it is. Listen to people who disagree with you. Listen to your neighbors. Too many of us are bowling alone, don't even talk to our neighbors or our relatives or our fellow congregants. Listen to them, engage them, even if they disagree with you about very important issues. If you do that, if you do what Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia did as a matter of course, then you will realize, still, as divided as we are, as angry at each other as we are, that the things that unite us are still stronger than the things that divide us. That is true for us as Jews, and it's also true for us as Americans. And it is that, rather than any talking point that my friend JJ made or that I made tonight, that I wish you to take away from this evening. Remember to listen, try to learn. If we do that, we have a path to sanity, if not safety. And thank you again.
Thank you, Jonathan. JJ.
Well, 2 points. First of all, for democracy to work, not only does the majority get to rule, but the minority has to agree to lose. If the minority is so convinced that the other side spells death for all of us, it's very hard to give them the opportunity. So viewing the other side's opinions as an existential threat to our lives simply makes it impossible to work together or compromise. But how do we get there? I can give you a personal experience that sort of guided my life in a lot of ways for the last 40 years or so. I don't know how applicable it is, but you can look for it. I have in-laws, my sister-in-law, in fact, and her family they're settlers in Hebron in the West Bank. It's a community of about 1,000 people that is arguably, by reputation, the most extreme, uncompromising wing of the settler movement. Here you have two sisters, one of whom was one of the founders of the extreme wing of the settler movement, and the other of whom was one of the founders of American Friends of Peace Now. They talk on the phone a couple of times a month. They don't talk much about politics because they're only getting into a fight, although the brothers-in-law talk about politics often enough because we like each other and it's fun. But we recognize we don't represent a personal threat to each other. And we can do one more thing, and I'll tell you how it happens. It was probably about 20 years ago when her kids were younger. She had two teenage boys, were the oldest. They're now married, have kids of their own. And they came to their dad one day, Ezer Weitzman, who was then the president of Israel. It was during Rabin's period, and he was visiting Hebron with a big entourage. He was a big dove, and he was trying to show how he would listen to the other side. And the boys came to their dad and they said, Abba, we're going to go with our friends downtown. Ezer Weitzman is going to be here and we're going to throw stuff at him. And their father said, you can't throw stuff at him. He's the president of Israel. And the boy said, oh, Kelev Smolani, he's a leftist dog. And he said, you know, Doda Shifra is Smolania. Aunt Shifra and Uncle JJ are leftists. And their reaction was, oh, so leftism is not really that bad. He said, no, it's just somebody who disagrees with you. And that has changed our family dynamic for decades. It makes it possible for us to be a family, even though we so strongly disagree. It makes me think every time I write about the importance of dismantling the settlements, I am calling for great harm to my in-laws. I need to weep over what I'm saying. I have to believe it, but I have to weep, and I have to understand there's people on both sides.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Cindy, I just want to comment that the rabbis, underlining what both of you have said, but certainly what Jonathan said, one of the commentaries that the rabbis make is that we have 2 ears and only one mouth, so we should listen, Shema, in case the word is unfamiliar to you, we should listen at least twice as much as we should speak. One of the questions, and maybe Cindy will comment on it, is about recording for those that had some trouble getting in. And I will just note that there are well over 300 people who have listened to the end. And Cindy, please take it.
Thank you so much. What an inspiring message at the end. After listening to you have completely different points of view, you agreed that Jews can walk and chew gum, which I was glad that we had one place that you were in agreement, but I understand you're great friends. I think it's so important in this time, in this culture, that we can have these conversations or not have these conversations and talk about music or theater or something if we're completely opposed to each other's point of view. But it's so important that we come together. And what a beautiful job that the two of you did. Rabbi Lotkert, you were amazing. You did a fabulous job. I want to thank Sherry Dukowski, who's such a great partner for me and has been for 12 years. And I love working with her. And a big shout out to our Zoom admin up there, Eileen Tatro from Temple Beth Israel in San Diego, who did a great job of making sure that everything came together. We will have a recording. It will be up on a number of different websites. So if you can reach out to me, I think everybody has my email. If you want to know where to find the recording, if you want to listen to it again, there were some great points made. You can write them down and make them later to other people. But you both did an excellent job. I think you covered absolutely every issue that there is to cover in this conflict, which is pretty amazing in an hour and 30 minutes.
You didn't see the rest of the questions.
I was looking at them.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Thank you, JJ. Thank you, Jonathan. Really inspiring. Thank you, Rabbi Lotkert, for doing such a great job. And let's listen to each other and be better with each other, because if we don't, we're really going to be in trouble. And that's the most important thing we could do.
So the traditional word of parting in Hebrew is lehitraot. And I was talking with my Israeli cousin, and as JJ mentioned, we are absolutely on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. And as I was about to leave her, it just struck me that what I really should be saying is lehit ramot. So until we meet again remotely or in person, thank you, Cindy, for all the work that you did in pulling this together.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care and stay healthy.